Okay, so welcome everyone to the May Liverpool Dementia and Aging Research Forum. Today we have a very lovely and interesting speaker. We have Fran Chasty, who's a final year DClin trainee at the University of Liverpool. And her project has looked at staff experiences and training needs in care homes about older adults, sexuality, intimacy, and relationships. So today she'll be talking about her research project and her systematic review and the topic as a whole, which is really not touched upon that much in research, but also in practice. So if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box throughout. We'll pick them up afterwards and we'll have a chat and Q&A with Fran afterwards. And if you also are engaging on social media, just join us on Twitter, for example, with the hashtag Liverpool Dementia. But Fran, if you could share your screen now, please.
Yeah, thanks, Clarissa. Okay, you can see that okay?
Yeah, if you want to go on full.
Yeah.
And handing over to Fran now.
Thanks again, Clarissa. So hi everyone, thanks so much for coming today. So this is the title of what I'm going to be talking about today. So sexuality and relationships in care homes. So what are staff experiences and what are some of the training needs? So like Clarissa said, this is a project that I'm kind of leading on, but Clarissa and Sarah Butchard are supervising this project. Okay. So just to introduce myself, I know a few people here already, but I think to most of you I'll be a new face. So I'm a third year trainee clinical psychologist, and kind of what that means is that as part of our 3-year training programme, we conduct a thesis throughout that three years. So like Clarissa said, we do one main research project and then we also do a systematic review alongside that. So today, what I'm going to cover is, so kind of starting by just thinking broadly about sexuality and then thinking about it within older age, thinking about it specifically within health and social care settings. Then I'm going to share with you what it is that I'm doing my systematic review on, where we're up to with that, some of the initial findings that we've come across. Then I'll go on to talk about the empirical study itself. So that's the study that I'm doing with staff in care homes, thinking about sexuality and relationships. And then just thinking about bringing that all together, and then quite a bit of time for any questions and discussion as well. I'm aware that people here today, you know, will have varied experiences and lots of things that I'm sure they can share and bring to the discussion. So that will be really helpful. I think for all of us, including me, when I started this project, I have had lots of questions, but I think I have even more now. So it'll be great to hear from all of you that are here. Okay, so to begin with, I'm going to invite you all, if it's okay, if you have either a phone or if you could do this on your laptop. I don't know if people are familiar with this. It's something called menti.com. If you literally just put menti.com into a search browser. And then if you are able to just enter this code, so 17808084. And then there's the option there to just put in three words, so how you would define sexuality. And then it's anonymous. I'm then going to share with you what comes up. So that's 17808084. And then if I'll just stop sharing this for a moment. So this is just to get us thinking together about what are we actually here to talk about, what actually is sexuality. I'm hoping you can all see that screen. Oh, brilliant. Oh, thank you so much for doing this. That's great to see some words coming up. Brilliant. So things like relationships, what you like, feelings has come up a few times, what turns someone on, personality, expression, what you're attracted by, about it being unique, individual, that seems to be something that's coming up on the spectrum. brilliant. Expression, connection. Okay. I'll just leave that there just for 1 more minute, just in case anyone else wanted to share anything. There's definite themes coming up. So something about feelings, desire, attraction. Someone's put essential. Someone's put love. Okay, brilliant. We've got fluid, connection, connections, unique. Yeah. Okay, brilliant. I'm going to stop sharing that now, but I can always come back to that at the end and see if anything else has been added. Okay. Thank you for doing that. Okay. So the reason that I wanted to start with that really is to make the point of just how broad the term sexuality is. I think doing this project has really highlighted that to me. It's definitely something that I've learned, and so I wanted to share that and just kind of make that point early on of just how broad it is and how it means different things to different people as well. And we'll at this point just share kind of an official definition. So this is a World Health Organization definition of sexuality. So they define it as being a central aspect of being human throughout life. So it encompasses sex, gender identities and roles, sexual orientation, eroticism, pleasure, intimacy and reproduction. It's experienced and expressed in thoughts, fantasies, desires, beliefs, attitudes, values, behaviours, practices, roles and relationships. And while sexuality can include all of these dimensions, not all of them are always experienced or always expressed. Sexuality is influenced by the interaction of biological, psychological, social, economic, political, cultural, legal, historical, religious, and spiritual factors. Okay. So this is slightly deceiving, the screen, because it looks like I'm going to play a video and I'm not. It is just a screenshot. But I wanted to share this image. So we've thought broadly there kind of about the idea of sexuality, but I wanted to share this image, which is taken from a recent campaign that was run around older adult sexuality. Partly just to take a minute to see maybe what comes to your mind, whether there's anything different in terms of what we've already thought about when we're thinking of sexuality. Is there anything specific that comes to mind if we then take that into older adult sexuality? I also just wanted to share this campaign for anyone that's not come across it already. It was a joint campaign by the photographer Rankin and Relate, the counselling service, and they did a specialist campaign around thinking about sexuality in older age, and there's some really beautiful photos from that campaign, so I wanted to highlight that. Okay. So sexuality in older age. So just to say, when we're thinking about older age, we are thinking about generally about kind of 65 years plus. Any of the literature or all the research out there, that's kind of where they're basing it. So to say that it is true that as people get older, there are changes that are associated with sexuality. There are natural parts of aging that do impact elements of sexuality. There's also kind of secondary. Sorry, I'm muted.
I wonder, did the director just not ask her before?
Hi everyone. Could everyone please mute themselves? Thank you. Go on, Fran.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, so there's natural aging, but then there's also kind of secondary impact. So if we think about as people get older, there's also generally an increase in illness, there's an increase in medication, and that there can be kind of comorbidity there in terms of changes to one's physical health. And so when we think more practically around the kind of behavioural aspect of sexuality, so the actual act of having sex, that can be impacted as people get older for those reasons. Another factor, the more kind of psychological, is that as people get older, naturally their bodies change. And this can result in kind of lower sense of body image, lower self-esteem, which can also impact when we're thinking about intimacy. But the notion that older age automatically means that sexuality is no longer important. That idea is a myth. It's one that perhaps is, well, the campaign that I've just shared there, they did a survey, and they found that 2/3 of people over the age of 65 found that their age group is just not represented at all in the media. And research shows that despite this, many older people are interested in sex and intimacy, in the physical side of it, in the emotional side of it. There's also a lot around kind of the desire to maintain freedom for sexual expression, whether it's through companionship, but also through identity, also through presentation. And just to say that obviously this is complex. So coming back to the survey I've just mentioned there, they also found that around 60% of older 65-year-olds aren't comfortable talking about sex and sexuality, with the number one reason being embarrassment, but also just not feeling comfortable talking about the topic, the idea that when they were younger it wasn't something that was talked about as much, and also a worry of making someone else feel uncomfortable, the worry of making the person that they're talking to feel uncomfortable, are all barriers for individuals over 65 wanting to talk about this topic to someone. Okay, so then coming on to how sexuality and relationships and intimacy is talked about within health and social care settings. And I know that my priority coming here today is to talk about settings where people with dementia might be, but as I'll come on to it in a moment, some of my research and my literature review has looked more generally around health and social care settings. So the research is kind of shown us that whilst a lot of staff recognise the importance of thinking about sexuality, of talking about it, there are a lot of barriers that get in the way. So the main things that kind of stand out are staff's own concern regarding their lack of knowledge, their lack of skill, confidence, comfort. So whilst they recognise that they want to talk about it, it's can feel really difficult, and so it ends up just being something that's avoided. Research has also shown from both staff and service users' perspectives how sexuality is often a taboo in these settings. So there are particular things that stand out. So things like older women and pleasure is right up there as a taboo that just doesn't get talked about, doesn't get thought about. If we think more specifically around care homes, the needs of intimacy are often overlooked. That's something that's kind of really come out in the research that people comment on. Things like ageist, heteronormative, cisgendered assumptions are commonplace in care homes. And a systematic review of residents' perspectives on this found that they perceive staff to generally be uninterested and to lack knowledge, which is something that staff are acknowledging themselves as well. Okay, so if I come on first to talk about the systematic review that we're doing. So given the nature of my research project being around care homes, ideally we wanted to focus purely on care homes and think about what training staff are receiving around sexuality and relationships. We found out quite early on that there's not a lot of data out there. There's not a lot of research specifically on this. And so we've had to broaden that out. So we broadened it out from just looking at care homes to looking at any health or social care setting where an individual is staying there for a longer period of time. So the title of our systematic review is Staff Training Interventions, Focusing on Adult Sexuality in Health and Social Care Long-Term Settings, Mixed Methods Systematic Review. And what we're hoping to kind of find out is what does training look like in these settings? What are staff receiving training on? So what's the content? What's the method of delivery? And what's the effectiveness? So is this increasing things like knowledge that staff are saying that they struggle with, that they're aware that they maybe don't have as much knowledge as they'd like, and what are staff's views on the training as well. So the systematic review itself, so we search papers using words like some of those that I've just mentioned, so things like care homes, rehabilitation settings, inpatient settings, and then looking at anything around a training, educational intervention on the topic of sexuality, intimacy, relationships, which came out with around 3,600 papers. And from there, we've narrowed it down to around 13 that actually fit that criteria. So today I thought what I'll do is I'll share 2 of the papers that we've come across, just to kind of give an idea of what we're kind of finding, what kind of training is out there in terms of what's been published. This isn't to say that this is the only training that happens, because actually I think there's a lot of training, a lot more training that happens, but it's just not always written up as an empirical paper. So we've purposefully chosen 2 papers today that focus on training for older adults, for staff working with older adults. So the first one on the left, so this is a paper from 2016. And this is where, so the authors used an e-learning resource, and this was with the aim to improve knowledge and attitudes of aged care staff. So this was specifically thinking about people working with people with dementia, with the notion of some of the behaviours that can happen as a result of dementia can be challenging for staff. So this was a self-directed e-learning resource, and so they focused on things like intimacy, sexuality and sexual behaviour, dementia and the expression of sexuality, ethical considerations, so policy guidelines, development for sexuality and dementia in care homes, developing sexualities and dementia policy guidelines for care practice. And the way that they assessed how effective the resource was they used 2 scales that have come up a lot in the systematic review. So the aging and sexuality knowledge and attitudes scale, and the staff attitudes about intimacy and dementia survey. Just to say, both of those scales are available freely online as well. And so they found that there was a significant increase in scores after this intervention. They did look to see whether any of the changes in scores were associated with any of the demographic data that they took, but they found there to be no association. Although, just to make the point that the demographic data was quite limited, so they were able to compare it to things like age and gender and staff role, but there wasn't a whole lot more in terms of demographics. And then an example of another paper that's come up. So this one's quite different. This one's around creating supportive environments for LGBT older adults, and efficacy evaluation of staff training in a senior living facility. So this one was face-to-face training. So it's a 4-hour training workshop, and they focused on language and terminology within the LGBT community. They had specific activities to encourage thinking around socio-political context that would affect LGBT elders across the lifespan. They looked at unique concerns and needs for LGBT population framed within this context. They looked at best practice and skills, and they also used role play scenarios. So again, they looked for, so they used bespoke scales, but they looked for changes in knowledge and attitudes, and found that there was a significant increase in both of those. They also looked at perceived preparedness. So prior to the training, they asked participants how prepared they felt in terms of thinking about their LGBT residents. And they found that after training, there was a significant decrease in terms of how prepared people feel, which I take to mean as people kind of having an increased awareness of actually what needs to be thought about, and that beforehand they probably weren't thinking about the things that they kind of need to be thinking about. With both of these, staff feedback was that they really appreciate the opportunity to have training on this, because of it being such a rare opportunity. What definitely came out is the importance of having time for staff discussion. So the one on the left, where it was purely a self-directed online tool, whilst it was convenient, they felt like they missed out because of not being able to talk and share ideas with the rest of their team. Okay, so just moving on from the systematic review. So to come on to tell you about the research study that we're doing, that we're just kind of finishing at the moment. I just really wanted to make the point at the beginning that this study has been a real team effort. So I've met with many different advisors who have kind of given me the go-ahead to recognise them when I'm sharing this study. So 2 who have experience when thinking about dementia and thinking about care homes, and then an advisor as well from Lgbt Switchboard, and they've been there to help me think about what kind of questions we might want to ask participants, and also thinking about writing up the findings, thinking about discussion as well. So the rationale for this study. So when I first met with Clarissa and Sarah for us to think about what it might be that we'd like to do the research project on, we all had a shared interest around kind of older adults. I'd had experience working with older adults prior to getting onto training. I'd also worked as a support worker for some time and been really fortunate, had really, really brilliant training as part of that job. But was kind of aware that I hadn't had training on sexuality. That hadn't been something that had ever kind of come up. So between us, when we kind of started talking, we thought this could be interesting to explore in the context of thinking about older people and staff's role. So our aim was to seek staff's views on their own and the care home's approach to considering resident sexuality, including relationships and intimacy needs. So recruitment, I'm sure as lots of people on here will have had similar experiences over the last few years. Recruitment has been quite tricky. We quite quickly moved to online. So everyone that all the staff that I've spoken to online. But we have now completed also I've met with 12 individual staff members. So I've completed a one-to-one interview with every staff member. Interviews have lasted around 45 minutes. It involves having 10 pre-prepared questions to kind of guide the interview, to guide the discussion. After, say, 3 or 4 interviews, those questions get slightly modified so that we can start looking for more detail on things that we're noticing aren't kind of coming through in the interviews. And to say here as well, so when I share the findings, just to make the point that our participants, so it's been mainly females, white, British, around the age of kind of 40s, 50s, and predominantly heterosexual as well. We did want to seek all of that information because we wanted to be clear about kind of who our data is representing and who we've spoken with. So in terms of sharing the findings from the staff interviews, I thought today perhaps the best way to do that would be to share some quotes with you of what people have shared. So this is in response to being asked things like, how do you perceive sexuality to be talked about in the care home setting? Or what do you feel has prepared you in your role to think about sexuality in this context? How do you consider rights? So thinking about things like capacity, consent, privacy. Okay. So one of the first things that came up is this idea of experience. Yes, 100%. So this is a definite theme that has come up from these staff interviews, and that's the idea of staff saying that. So I think of the 12 that I've interviewed, I think 8 told me that they have never had any training whatsoever on anything to do with sexuality. And then 3 told me that it had come up in the context of equality and diversity training, but that training had maybe lasted an hour. And so they didn't feel like it had gone into much depth. And then 1 person had it specifically around thinking about challenging behaviour when working with people with dementia. So when I was asking people, so, you know, what do you feel has prepared you in your role for thinking about this? People told me a lot about personal experience. So whether it's that they've worked in care for a long time, people also shared things like if they grew up in a family where sexuality was something that was talked about quite openly, that they kind of reflected on the fact that that meant that they felt more able to talk about it. Quite a few, like I said, because of the participants being in the kind of predominantly in the kind of 40-50 age range, it was quite interesting that quite a lot of people made the comparison between themselves and then thinking about younger staff members. So people talked about that in both in terms of it's probably kind of harder for the younger people to think about it because they've just had less experience. And also kind of thinking of quite kind of protective, so thinking about how it must be for younger staff perhaps to see things in the care home that they might not be expecting, which was another thing that came through a lot, which was this idea of the unexpected. So not feeling prepared when they first started working in this role, not feeling prepared for what they might see. So a lot of people, the first thing they shared with me when I asked them a question in the interview, the first thing that they shared was their complete shock when they started working in a care home to walk into a communal area and for a resident to be masturbating openly in a space. And people were very, very respectful of the way that they talked about it, and they really wanted me to know that their priority was to ensure that person's dignity, but just how shocking that was and how unprepared they were for that, and how for other members of staff that potentially could be really triggering if they hadn't known that that was going to be something they would encounter. Okay, so I think it's a society-wide thing about people once they're at hitting a certain age, but I think it's magnified by people coming into care. So another theme that came out is people were very kind of reflective in terms of thinking about wider society norms, expectations. So people talked about kind of desexualization in older age. Like I said before, people talked about less representation in the media. And then this idea that you take that from society and then someone moves into a care home and how that just gets even more magnified. So the idea that no interest in sex, no interest in intimacy, no interest in any kind of more romantic or connection or relationship. They thought, people kind of talked around perhaps why that might be, some of the practicalities. So, you know, a sudden decrease in privacy for individuals. So just kind of not thinking about people in that way, perhaps because of the more kind of communal way of living. Someone as well, I think, shared something really interesting where they said that because of the nature of staff-resident relationships in care homes and how it's often this idea of kind of being like a family, someone said, you know, I'd happily talk to a 65-year-old colleague about something to do with sexuality, but the idea of talking to a resident about that is completely different, because to me, it's almost like they're a grandparent figure, and that's not something I would ever talk to a parent or a grandparent about. So I think that relational kind of aspect on it is really interesting and is something that perhaps could be explored further. Unless there's an issue that comes up where there is sexual behaviour, it's not discussed. I think most people, I think, told me this, that they have very, very little experience of sexuality ever having been talked about, whether it be with a resident or within the staff team itself, and that it's often out of necessity. So it's often if there's been inappropriate sexual behaviour, so if there's been disinhibited behaviour that needs responding to, then it will get thought about. We don't really have an issue with sexuality in the care home I'm in because they've got dementia. This quote I think is quite interesting, and I think it represents a few people that kind of took part in that. quite a few people said, well, I've just never come across it. It's just never been a thing. So I don't know. It's not something I've ever thought about. Again, potentially kind of coming into what I was saying before about someone saying about it being a grandparent figure in their mind, and so perhaps it just not having been something that's kind of automatically come to them as something to think about, which is what people shared. It's not, they have the kind of standard things that they might think about for someone, and people talked a lot about individual person-centered care, but that sexuality just isn't part of that list of things that they kind of automatically go to. Another quote, so I think they just treat like for like, and everyone's, you know, it's not an issue. I wouldn't think they'd be treated any different to anyone else. So this is in response to a specific question around asking individuals to think about considerations for LGBT individuals in the care home. And the reason that I've chosen this quote is partly this idea of you know, everyone, we should treat everybody the same, and this, some people in their interviews reference that they know that that's often something that gets said, and as a consequence of that, then actually all the kind of more unique considerations that do need to be thought about for people with LGBT massively get missed. The other part of this quote that I think is interesting is, I wouldn't think they'd be treated. So most people that I spoke to said, so I had someone who said that they've worked in care for 20 years and they've never known anybody that and never known a resident to be openly identifying as LGBT plus. I think this is a real area that highlights further research and further work that can be done, because you know, obviously statistically that just is highly unlikely that that's the case, and also why is it that at this kind of, I wouldn't think that they be treated, so it's kind of that idea of we'll think about that if and when it happens, as opposed to the more kind of proactive approach, which quite a few people who I interviewed were kind of thinking about that as they're in the interview. I could kind of see them kind of thinking more kind of around that. And then just a couple more quotes to pick up on. So this one here, so because they've obviously forgotten who their partner is, they'll kind of buddy up a bit, and this is where I get confused. If you've got no capacity to understand that they're doing what they're doing, are they okay to be left alone, to hold hands and sit on the sofa and snuggle, or should we be intervening? This, I think, highlights a lot of the uncertainty that came through within the interviews. So people's uncertainty specifically here around capacity issues when it comes to potentially forming new relationships. People's uncertainty extended out from there as well. So there's this kind of real moral question around, if a resident is in a relationship with someone who isn't in the care home, they know that to be a monogamous relationship, and then that person is starting a new relationship with someone else in the home. People were saying that they really struggle around knowing what to do. Often the first kind of port of call is to distract that individual, so just to kind of take the individual away so that then just nothing can happen and it doesn't need to be an issue that needs to be thought about. But yeah, people's real uncertainty, highlighting that they don't feel like, again, they've maybe been prepared for dealing with those kind of situations. They're not quite sure what their role is. Like, here, should they be intervening? Are there guidelines around that? And then just this last quote here. So I've just got lots of ideas popping around in my head, you know, for how we can make this better for people living here. I wanted to finish, I think, on this quote, because throughout the interviews there was a real sense from people that they, like I said at the beginning, that people do think this topic is really important. Quite a few people reflected either in the interview or just afterwards when we finished recording, and I was just kind of checking in that people were okay and did they feel it had gone all right, that kind of thing. And people said, oh, I've talked about things here that I haven't thought about before, and now I'm thinking of these things that maybe I could go away and think more about, or I'm going to go and talk to a colleague about that. Or a few of the managers that I spoke with were kind of saying, oh, I'm going to think about that in terms of supporting staff. So just to kind of come to an end really on kind of what I've shared there, a few reflections that I just wanted to share myself, and then it'll be really great to hear from all of you. Obviously, I'm aware that this project has taken place during COVID. We did have some specific questions for staff around thinking about the impact of COVID on things like sexual expression. But it surprisingly, I thought it didn't actually bring up that much. People generally said that they didn't see that it had had any kind of major impact. The only place where it had an impact was thinking about in terms of connection with other people, but that was something that people were talking about a lot already, and that kind of need for intimacy or need for connection with other people. Just to say as well that I think, I guess my hopes from this study is that it highlights the need for staff to have the opportunity for training and a space to talk about this stuff, but also that it doesn't kind of start and end there, just how complex this is. I've been thinking about the idea of person-centered care and individual care, but with something as complex as this, how is that for staff when their own values are different to those of the person that they're caring for? Or if a topic comes up that's kind of really personally difficult for them to talk about or think about, all those things like embarrassment, I think all of those things need to be thought about carefully when we think about training and support. So that's the two kind of main reflections that I kind of wanted to share at this point. Also, I just wanted to highlight this. Clarissa sent, I think Clarissa might have tweeted this yesterday, so some people might have already seen this, but Clarissa sent me this yesterday from the, I think, was it the Alzheimer's Society conference? Please correct me if I've got that wrong, but just that this is interesting that this is a tool that's been developed by the Alzheimer's Society. It's called Lifting the Lid, or Lift the Lid, and it's kind of a purpose-made kind of tool for working with staff in care homes to kind of start conversations around sex, intimacy, and relationships. I think we do have the link to kind of more information on that, so if anyone wants to hear any more about it, we can pass that on. But I just wanted to highlight it just to show that I guess just that it's really positive that was there yesterday, that you know, there are things happening. I think it's easy from the research to think that this is something that never gets talked about and that there's no training on it at all, and actually that's not the case. There are pockets of places where this is getting talked about, and I think this is a really nice example of that. So I shall finish there. I'm wondering, if I stop sharing my screen, or
if you maybe just want to leave on the next slide whilst we have the Q&A, that'd be great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Fran. You, really interesting, but I mean, I'm biased anyways, so I anyways like your topic area. But I hope for all of you it's been really interesting and insightful, and maybe makes you think about this topic as well. We don't all have to work in a care home or work with people that live in a care home, for example, but it's maybe much more broader, the topic area that you're looking at, Fran, about sexuality and aging, I think, as you introduced in the first part. And maybe just to kind of, from my, I suppose, outside perspective, because you've been immersed so deeply in the data, it's really shocking, I suppose, to hear that there's so much lack of training, isn't there, in care home staff, and this huge level still of embarrassment. And that makes me think, how come some care home staff might be embarrassed about the topic area when they're working in a care home, they're doing personal care tasks, they're washing someone, they're feeding someone. These might, if they don't feel embarrassed about this, how can they feel possibly embarrassed about thinking about or discussing this? Okay, so I see some questions in the chat. So there's also been a question from Yvonne about your systematic review, Fran. And I said you'll submit this shortly. You're still in the midst of it, aren't you? So you've given us a highlight here.
Yeah, that's right.
And there's another question from Yvonne. When looking at care plans, often the sexuality section is the least completed.
Yeah.
What do you think would support staff more to have confidence in this area?
Yeah, that's so I interviewed a few managers, and someone shared that so one of the things that has changed, so kind of positive in terms of looking forward, is that people said that initial assessment forms have changed quite a bit over the years in terms of there being more space for thinking about sexuality, kind of more prompts, more more specifics around things that might be asked about. But exactly like you said, that it's often missed, it's often not filled in. I think one of the things potentially is thinking about the context in which sometimes when those forms are filled in, and my understanding from what I've heard, but if other people have ideas on this, it'd be really great to hear, is that often family members are also involved in filling those in and are often kind of sought for information. And that's something that a few people shared, is that in terms of their kind of feeling of embarrassment or awkwardness, it's at its most extreme when they're having to talk to family members. And so it's at that point that they're probably most likely to avoid the topic altogether. So that was actually one of the things that someone said that they were going to go away and think about, was how best to support staff when it comes to having these conversations with family members. But thinking more generally about the assessment form, I think my overriding sense from both research around training, but also from talking to people, and actually from my own experience of doing this project, is just pure kind of quality and quantity of just talking about the topic. The more that you talk about it over time, it just seems to lose that sense of feeling embarrassing for people. People in interviews often were quite nervous at the beginning. I kind of purposefully started with a question that was just thinking very generally about training and about their experiences of working in a care home, because I was conscious that people are just quite nervous to begin with. But I think the more that people are given an opportunity to talk and just to practice asking certain questions, I think people become more comfortable with it.
And this also picks up on a question and a statement from John Latham in terms of that stigma surrounding sexual behavior and general sexuality in care homes. But picking up on that form in particular that Yvonne is mentioning, I've just been speaking to a Dutch researcher this morning, Professor Debbie Gerritsen from Radboud University, and about care homes and human rights, actually. And I've mentioned your topic as well. And she said that across the Netherlands, generally, it's the same situation where this form for care home residents, the particular section on sexuality, etc., is often left blank. Yeah. So it's not just a situation here in the UK, but also in the Netherlands, where we think, oh, they're usually the trailblazers in care.
Yeah, really interesting. I think as well, I think it's people's uncertainty, that it comes back to that idea of uncertainty. And I think potentially people, I mean, I can't speak exactly for individual forms because I don't know how they're kind of worded, but I think people often feeling uncertain about what it is that is the expectation in terms of what's asked about, really not wanting to make people feel uncomfortable, which comes back to that point at the beginning of not wanting to place an assumption that all older people want to talk about this topic. And I think staff are often sensitive to that, and I think they don't want to make someone feel uncomfortable. But I guess it's when it becomes that we apply that to everybody, and actually it's not true for everyone. Some people do want to have the opportunity to talk about it.
Absolutely. And I forgot to mention, actually, because we're on Zoom now and we're not on Teams, if you do want to actually ask a question properly without the chat function, just raise your hand as well. We can do that as well. Yeah. There's a few more. So the card box looks interesting. When I saw it yesterday, thought that was a good next step possibly for what you're researching from the society. Mark has got a longer question. I don't know if he wants to discuss that himself or whether I just...
If you want.
Yes, sure.
So, I mean, I think it's a societal thing, and I'll put it in a couple of different ways. I think if I did a straw poll around the office now, I said this is on, the younger people would go, oh, I don't want to think about that. They don't. There's this sort of societal expectation that older people don't really do it, or if they do, they don't really want to think about the fact that they do, or might want to. And then that links with this idea that a care home is somebody's home, and they're usually paying for it. It's not like somebody's given them this free hotel to stay in. They've transferred their life to this space in which to live. And yet, I'm not surprised to hear what you're saying. I think it probably stretches to lots of other things, like what they eat and what they drink and how they regulate their life. It's very institutionalized, and the level of control and freedom over that personal space is diminished. And I guess this is an extreme end of that. But I wondered if any of those sorts of concepts had come up in the conversations you were having.
I don't know if specifically around that comparison to those other things like you mentioned. Don't think I've heard that. That's not to say it's not the case, but possibly the questions might not have lended itself to that. I don't know, but I haven't heard that. I guess what
does it resonate with you as a concept? Are you surprised you didn't hear anything like that?
I don't know, because I think when I hear you say things like kind of, what was it, food, kind of eating, and I kind of think it's easier to think of those in terms of how they can become institutionalized, because you have set times to do those things, for example.
It's choice of what you do with your life as well, isn't it?
Yeah. I guess this is maybe where the kind of less proactive stance comes in, perhaps, in terms of offering some of those choices. I mean, the sense of it being kind of more formal, if you like, I think that certainly came through when people were saying things like, the only time I ever really think about this is when I'm filling in initial assessment form, and then it's kind of like a tick box, and then it doesn't really get thought about much since. Or things that probably tie in a little bit with what you were saying there, Mark, was when people were saying that one of the only times it gets talked about is at handover, and it will be alongside those other things like you've just said. So updating other staff on things like meals or activities, and then it's if there's anything relating to sexuality. But I think there it's generally back to that idea of if there's been anything of concern around sexual behaviour, or if there's been like a particular conversation that needs to be shared with the staff. So I think I can see some comparison from what I've been told.
So I see Dorcas' hand, and I'll pick up on that in a second, but I think it's quite telling in itself that through your interviews, you have not really come across the fact that a care home is a home, and it should be a home where someone lives, feels comfortable, gets their family to see them at any time they can, and just it's a home where they can get some extra care effectively, as opposed to that institution, because we should really say it's an institution, is that it's a home with care on top of that. And it's quite telling if staff didn't pick up on that. Again, is that because staff doesn't receive enough training maybe to see that concept as a whole?
I actually had someone made the point that they'd recently been on some training, and that it had really kind of changed their thinking, and that they'd shifted from thinking that the residents were living in their workspace to the fact that actually no, they were working in the residents' home. And I do think that came through on people's interviews. I do think people do have this sense of it being someone's home. When they talked about the impact of moving into a care home, people made the comparison between what life was like before and what life is like now, and that not sitting well with them. Yeah.
Okay. So Dorcas, you've got a question?
It's just a comment. Thank you so much, Fran, for sharing your research with us. But I want you to realize, I know there is a need for training for staff to know about these things. But for older generation, it's a sensitive thing and private that we may not want to discuss. And when you are in a home, really, or a care home, it's not your home. You can't feel comfortable to even discuss that. I just, when they're doing the training, they need to put that into context to say, you know, you might even, especially the babe community, it's something we don't discuss at all. You know, I'm just saying, you know, it is hard. It will be hard for the staff to talk to us, and the same for the patient to talk to them about it.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah.
But maybe that's a societal thing as well, because if we look at like other countries, can we take some learning from that, or does it mean it should be like the way it is, or do we need to change things? So it's, I think, good that you discuss it with staff, but maybe also, what's it, Fran, do you know what the other side of the perspective is?
Well, I am really pleased that, thank you for sharing that point, because I think that's kind of what I was trying to say at the beginning, and I think you've made the point really well, is that is not having the assumption that all older adult residents are going to want to talk about this. And I think exactly like you said, actually, for a lot of people in that generation, they won't want to talk about it because of many different reasons, and it feeling uncomfortable and not something that they would want to share. But I think it's about having both. I think it's about acknowledging that some people won't want to, but also acknowledging that some people will want to. And then there's the other side of it. So there's the angle of kind of staff to resident conversations, but then it's also, so I asked staff in interviews as well about how this is talked about within staff teams. So not just about how it's talked about with residents, but actually more to get a sense of kind of the culture within staff teams themselves and how it's talked about, which I think, especially when we're thinking about things like sexually disinhibited behaviour, the way in which that can get talked about, I think, is you know, just as important as well.
Absolutely. So there's no more questions, but there's a few more comments from attendees in the chat, Fran, which you can have a look at. Also something from Hilary Tetlow and some other thoughts. So if you don't mind, could you do the next slide, please?
Yeah,
Fran?
of course.
Thank you. So thank you very much, Fran, for presenting your work. And Fran is going to submit her research very soon as well. So exciting times. You've done a great deal there. I just want to raise awareness of our next webinar, which will take place on the 20th of July from 1 till 2 o'clock again. And this time we'll hear from Dr. Warren Donnellan, who some of you might know already. He's a lecturer in psychology at the University of Liverpool, and he will be talking about resilience in dementia carers and pursuing a gold standard measure. So I've also copied the link into the chat, and I'll also share that via email afterwards. But it's been lovely hearing from you, Fran, hearing about your work, and thank you everyone for your questions and thoughts, and hopefully we'll see you in July again. Thank you.